We're in the Rosewood community within the city of Columbia, where Bob Askins is on a mission. Bob, thanks for inviting us to your yard. Tell me a little bit about the motivation to move from traditional turf to a landscape that incorporates native plants.
Well, a lot of my inspiration comes from my involvement with the Midlands chapter of the South Carolina Native Plant Society. I'm also a master naturalist, I think a Clemson extension program.
That's right.
So I've always been interested in nature and in plants, but largely I was a big birder. And if you love birds, you have to love insects, because birds need insects, particularly to raise their young. And if you want to have insects, you have to have native plants. Our native plants co-evolved with our insects, and so we hear about things like milkweed supporting monarchs, but we also need other plants that local insects can make use of to raise their young and feed birds and other animals as well.
So let's talk about the process. I understand maybe there was a fence that was here in the yard prior, and so that was the first step?
Right. We purchased this property in 2018, and there was an old cattle wire fence along one side that was had been overtaken by English ivy and other vines. There was Chinese privet and all sorts of...
All those invasive species.
All those invasive species. So first step was editing, taking that stuff out. And then we began adding native plants to replace the things we had removed. And it was amazing, Teresa. Within the first year, we saw a huge increase in the number of lizards, spiders, butterflies, bees.
Love it. It's like if you build it, they will come.
Exactly.
So what are some of the species that you started incorporating?
Some of the first things I put in were milkweed. But if you want milkweed to be most effective, you need to provide some food for the adult monarchs that are laying eggs. So
That's right.
Also started adding flowering perennials, things like asters and goldenrod and things that would be blooming at the times that monarchs came through to lay their eggs.
And monarchs aren't the only things that you want to attract to your yard. So what are some strategies for ensuring that you have things that are going to flower over long periods of time?
Well, that's a good point. I do try to pick perennials that bloom at different times of the year. So we've had a number of things that have already bloomed and finished, but one good example is blueberries. Everybody loves blueberries. I have several varieties of vaccinium here. They're an early bloomer, and they help support some of our native bees that also are early emergers. Our southeastern blueberry bumblebee is a very efficient pollinator. So those plants help to support that insect.
Sure, and not only do you have the benefit of being able to see those bees in the yard and they're doing their job, but then you can benefit from that fruit production as well.
Exactly, yeah. Everybody loves blueberries.
How about some native grasses? You have those incorporated as well?
Yeah, so native grasses are very, very important, but sometimes overlooked. I have Indian grass and switchgrass. I just added some purple top. I'm excited to see how that works out this year. But our native grasses put down very, very deep roots. So they are very resilient for that reason. They can handle our hot, dry weather in the summertime without any real problem. And then they also provide food for a number of moths and butterflies. Some of the seed is used by native birds, and then they also provide shelter. One thing that we sometimes overlook, but our native bunch grasses give insects, butterflies a place to hide out when there are storms or when the weather turns cold.
What do you think is the most unusual species that you have in your yard?
I have a couple of very rare native plants. One is Schweinnitz's sunflower, which is, I think, the rarest sunflower species in North America. I also have Stachys caroliniana, which is a plant that your frequent guest John Nelson rediscovered
That's
down
right.
on the coast of South Carolina, near where I grew up. And so I have a little sample of that here. Carolina bog mint is another rare plant. It's not a difficult plant to grow, but it's just because of habitat loss, it's become somewhat rare.
So we talked about monarchs and their need for milkweed as a host plant. But one of the common is called butterfly weed or butterfly milkweed. You know, most people probably aren't going to just flock to want to put a weed in their yard.
But it's such a showy, beautiful plant. It really in fact, we have some blooming right now. It's a gorgeous flowering plant to have in your landscape. It also is a very deep-rooted plant, so it's capable of surviving very well once it's established. And then, as you mentioned, it provides food for both adult and caterpillar stages of monarch butterflies.
I see that you have really embraced the idea of gardening with the environment in mind and have several certifications that reflect that.
Yes, indeed. One that is probably near and dear to your heart, Carolina Yard Certification.
Absolutely.
I think I got last year. And then the Gills Creek Watershed Association Champion, Watershed Champion is another one that's important to me because I'm really concerned about maintaining water quality levels and concerned about our rivers and other waterways.
Until recently, I understand that a yard such as yours may not have been allowed within the city limits.
That's right. City ordinances restricted the height of vegetation, particularly in front yards. The Native Plant Society recognized this as a potential problem for our members, and so we worked with the city, with Mayor Rickenmann and Dr. Bustles, to modify those requirements so that it would allow people a little more latitude in doing naturalistic plantings in their home lawns.
Sounds good. I look forward to learning more from the mayor. Mayor Rickenmann, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to speak with us. I understand there's been a recent ordinance change to allow for more naturalistic landscaping within the city.
Absolutely, and this was brought to us by our constituents and folks in town who really wanted to embrace a lot of our natural species and plants and get them growing, but it was very hard for our code enforcement people to really understand because their limited knowledge of plants. They looked at some of our natural species that are growing and plants growing that we want to have grown here as weeds because of the height and the way it is. So really addressing that, but also getting people to register their yards, which is really important to say, hey, this is what we're doing. We're building a natural setting. And when you look around yards like that we have here, it makes a big difference. I mean, since we've been sitting here, I'm watching all the bugs and the bees and everything and watching them pollinate, get in there and be part of it. So it's what we want to happen.
It really is. I'm so glad to hear that you and council were receptive into making that change because ordinances are in place for a reason. And you mentioned specifically the process that citizens would need to take on to let everyone know that this is an intentional thing and we're not just kind of ignoring our landscapes.
100%. But I do think this is why public input is so important and people reaching out, because there's probably ordinances in our books that don't really relate to what's happening today. And so we've got to change a lot of that. And we want to see more of this. I think today, more than ever, at least in this community, I feel as a capital city, we want to preserve our natural assets. We want more investment. What you're seeing us do at the river, what we're doing with these ordinance changes, the bioswales and the things we're thinking about for the future, getting rid of all these parking lots and really embracing our natural resources to protect them. Everybody wants to have the beauty of South Carolina to stay for generations, and little things make a big difference.
They do. The little things that each person can do in their own backyard. Thank you so much for being receptive to change, for appreciating the value of native plants and allowing the citizens of Columbia to protect natural resources in their own yards.
Well, and I think what we want to do too is encourage people to see what they can do and how they can have a balance of this, and how we can have better opportunities to share information, plants that people ought to be thinking about planting, reaching out to, if it's the Clemson Extension or our Gills Creek Watershed folks who have invested, heavily in it, or, National Wildlife who can help you design. Why not take advantage of this? And I think part of it is we got to continue to share information.
We really do, and there are so many educational resources out there. You mentioned a lot of them. We encourage people to take that education and put it into practice.
I'm with you on that.